Good morning. I've said more than a few times this morning, between the first service and now, and I'll say it again in front of everyone in case anybody misses it. It has been such a joy to be back with all of you. I was here, I believe, in July. That was my first time here. It's not my first time in Atlanta. I grew up in Atlanta. My mother and my sister are here, which makes me very happy. And so I'm just really grateful to be a part of this moment with all of you and to be singing with Donald, which I've been dreaming about for a few years now. So you know, dreams do come true. Some walls are made of stone. Do you remember hearing that lyric? Here we are yet again in the throes of worry and fear as the threat of war looms over all of us. It's hard to know what to do when egos and an ethos of domination are at the core of decision-making in this land. Sometimes we build our own. Do you remember that lyric? Far too many of us, when I say us, I'm really talking about queer and trans and non-binary folks like me, are still forced into places of loneliness and fear, even among people who claim to love us. And so many of us learn all too well how to protect our bodies and our minds and our hearts. Some walls stand for years. White supremacy culture persists in our faith, impacts all of us, and detrimentally affects the lived experiences of Black folks, of Indigenous folks, and other people of color in our congregations far and wide. This is a truth we must tell over and over again if culture shift is what we really want. And some walls wash away with tears. A colleague recently shared with me that she's spent years ignoring the reality of anti-Semitism in this country. It's just not something that impacted her life, she said. But the violence that occurred at a rabbi's home in Monsey, New York, as Jews in that area were celebrating the Hanukkah miracle, changed things for her. Why does it take such horrific acts for people to notice what has been true for a long, long, long time? Relevant on every scale is the study and practice of not just knowing ourselves, but being ourselves, being true to ourselves. Relevant on every scale is the study and practice of not just knowing the kind of community you want to be, or we say we want to be, but living it and breathing it every moment of every day. Reflecting on the first words, the first stanza of our anthem this morning, two words crept up from underneath for me. And the first of those words was fear. Fear of what's next, fear of moving forward, fear of being wrong, or perhaps even maybe fear of being right. The walls we and others put up give those fears their power. And the barriers that get built up all around us by systems and people and situations and old stories keep us from what is most real and most true about this life and how best to move through this life together. But why? Why on earth, Reverend Mykal, would anybody start the new year or a whole new decade talking about fears and walls. Why? Well, we have to give some credit to your minister, the good Reverend Terrence Strauss, who invited me to join her in this new worship series, Some Walls. So I believe you're probably going to hear Some Walls. You're probably going to hear the song a few more times over the course of this series. I was happy to join all of you in it. But mostly, we are here right now talking about fears and walls really because in any new season, and especially now, in this moment in time, it behooves us as individuals and as communities to assess where we are, take stock of what is, in order to understand what can and what ought to be moving forward. The one thing that we know for certain is that walls are everywhere. They're everywhere. They're all around us. Sure, walls can provide some shelter and a sense of security. Walls can and sometimes should make us comfortable. But walls of denial, walls of fear or shame, walls of silence, walls of complacency, and maybe a little too much comfort, persist. And as much as they persist in our bodies and in our minds, they persist in our homes, where we work, where we go to school, and yes, even in our communities of faith and connection, as wonderful as those places may be for us. All erected out of an unwillingness to, for better or for worse, for good or for ill, to exist beyond that which is most comfortable and most familiar. How many of us like comfort? How many of us really love what's most familiar? I'm not alone in it. But Audre Lorde is a great poet and essayist and black lesbian feminist, once wrote that afraid is a country where they issue us passports at birth and hope we never seek citizenship in any other country. Let me say that one again. Afraid is a country where they issue us passports at birth and hope we never seek citizenship in any other country. We really like to be just where we are. Don't go too far ahead. Don't look behind. Certainly don't try and get over or go through. Mark Nepo, who is a spiritual writer, a poet, and a philosopher, he wrote this really wonderful book of reflections called the Book of Awakening, which I was actually laughing about. I like to think that this book is mine, but it actually belongs to my spouse, Lelena. But it was so amazing and wonderful that I've just kind of taken it on as mine, and I keep it with me everywhere. I don't even know if you know where it is at this point. I do. I might tell you when we get home. But this is a beautiful, beautiful book of reflections for every single day of the year. And in it, Nepo writes about barriers and the fear that keeps them before us. This sort of waiting on and wading through uncertainty. He called this reflection seeing into darkness. And it begins by him saying that fear gets its power from our not looking at either the fear or what we're afraid of. He makes this point by referring to that all too familiar attic or closet door behind which something terrifying waited. You remember when you were a kid, or maybe as grown-ups for some of us, right? Like let me not pretend like it's just young'uns who experience this, where there's a door, and behind it you've just created this remarkable monster that exists on the other side of that door, and the last thing you're going to do is go through it. Do some of us know what I'm talking about? I certainly had one of those rooms in my house. But he talks about this, and he says, the longer we don't look, the harder it is to actually open that door. and confront what's inside. So one day, Nepo writes, he opened that attic door, having stood in front of it for a long, long time, with little more than a pounding heart and a child's determination. And once he opened it, he stood at the threshold, and guess what happened? Not a single thing. Nothing happened. And the more he inched his way in, and the longer he stood in the heart of the unknown, his breathing actually slowed, and his eyes adjusted. Pretty soon, he said, he was able to explore that room, and ultimately, apparently found the only photos he'd ever seen of the grandfather that everyone said he was the most like. Seeing those pictures, he said, opened me up to aspects of my own spirit. But he wouldn't have ever seen them if he had not removed the barrier and gone inside. It's easy to forget that the process of moving through the barrier has healing properties in its own right, whether we're chipping away at that wall a little at a time or just bulldozing our way through. It matters that we go through the process. The complexities and new ways of thinking and being that get discovered or resurrected even when the walls come down can bring into full view everything that makes us who we are and everything that makes beloved community a reality and not just a catchy phrase that we like to use when we want to tell ourselves that we're doing all of the right things. We just have to be willing to get comfortable with our own discomfort and give ourselves however long it takes, and that's different for all of us, to get our bearings and allow our eyes to adjust, all of our senses to adjust to what's happening. I continue to be reminded everywhere I go, that we will never fully understand that which we have not been intentional about making room for. When we enter those sometimes hard places, when we loose ourselves of the fear of what might happen when the walls come down, we not only grow our own hearts, we become a different kind of community. A different and better community. And when we do that, we become agents of change in the wider world. As we dive deeper into this series, as you continue to move through this series together, we can approach the question of how we begin to break down these walls with some lessons to live by. I thought to myself, well, what do I need to know to help break down some of my own walls? Because believe me, I still have some. And this is what I came up with. Lesson number 1, how our walls come down may need to be different for each of us. What you may need and what I may need to begin to break down some of those walls might be different. And that's okay. Because the second lesson in wall breaking is that even though my techniques and my strategies might be different from yours, that doesn't mean that we can't learn from one another. The next lesson in wall breaking is recognizing the value of no longer remaining silent about our own stories and how they can, or maybe even how they should or should not impact the communities that we find ourselves in. Audre Lorde had some reflections on this. She wrote quite a bit in the aftermath of receiving a cancer diagnosis. She wrote so much about her particular experience. And so upon learning about a liver cancer diagnosis, she had breast cancer years before that, she wrote some really powerful words. She said, "In becoming forcibly and essentially aware of my mortality and of what I wished and wanted for my life, however short it might be, priorities and omissions became strongly etched in a merciless light. And what I most regretted were my silences. Of what had I ever been afraid? To question or to speak as I believed could have meant pain or death. But she goes on to say, we all hurt in so many different ways all the time, and pain will either change or it will end. The fourth lesson, what we may find on the other side of walls of stone that have been around for generations, what we may find might be scary. And there might not be a script for what to do next. How many of us love scripts? We like to know how things are going to go. How many control freaks are in the room? We all like scripts, right? But it's okay that there won't be one, or there might not be one, or it might not be what you expect. All of that is not only okay, but it leaves room for that other word. Remember I said there were two words that kind of crept up for me underneath all of these lyrics that I was listening to? The first word was fear, but the other word was possibility. Possibility. This is where a story of prophetic imagination and a theology of abundance comes in. There's a gentleman who many of us may have never heard of, may never hear from again. His name's John Gurton. He's a minister in Indianapolis from a different tradition. He gave his last sermon on December 29th, 2019. He resigned. And in addition to acknowledging the fatigue and mental health struggles that come with pastoring a church, did you all know that pastoring a church is hard work? Anybody know that? It is. It is, in all the ways that you can imagine, and in a whole lot of ways you probably can't. But, in addition to being able to acknowledge the sort of emotional toil and the fatigue that he was feeling, Gurton was also clear about something else. He said, many urban churches, including my own, are still operating on models from the 1960s. So many churches have not evolved or incorporated some of the necessary changes in order for them to meet the challenges that modern social justice issues bring or require. I think what my resignation represents is a pivotal moment in the church to find a better model moving forward. A new model must emerge. Now understand, this was not someone who had been at this church for 25, 35 years. He'd actually only been there for, I think, 6 or 7. But in that amount of time, he had moved the congregation from 15 members to 150. He had started a whole social justice ministry. I believe there was a food pantry involved. He had connected with local organizations to do community organizing. He had done remarkable things. He could have stayed. And just, made his way through and continued to do remarkable things. But he knew something that he wanted other people to really believe. And that was that in order for that congregation to live into a sense of possibility, to do a new thing, he knew based on how he was showing up that he needed to leave. Deeply, deeply powerful and prophetic ministry was his resignation. New models and new stories make way for more possibility, all of which begin to see the light of day when all those massive walls begin to come down. And how will we ever know what is really possible if we don't make way for it? It's intentional work that has to be done. We can't just kind of wait for it to happen. That's not how it works. We have to do it. However scary it might be or uncertain things may seem on the other side. In the song that we sang during the offertory, Brandy Carlisle, I did it right this time, wrote, "Can you fight the urge to run for another day? You might make it further if you learn to stay and either chip away a little at a time or begin to bulldoze right through all of those walls." She also says, you can dance in a hurricane but only if you're standing in the eye. Only if you're in it, doing it, being it, living it. That is how we grow. That is how we become who we say we want to be. Let's do it. It's a new year. We have this glorious opportunity to begin again. May it be so not just in this place, but in all of the places we call home. Ashe. Amen. And blessed be.